On the staff map, the Japanese bunker line looked like a wall, not a trench, not a patrol screen, a wall. But one Gurkha officer was not looking at the wall. He was looking at the empty ground behind it, 15 yards of jungle shadow, a place the guns could not reach, a place the defenders did not expect anyone to enter, a place so useless to every frontal assault that 7 battalions had already bled against the wrong side of it. And in Burma in 1943, that kind of empty ground could decide whether men lived or disappeared. The report that reached brigade headquarters later did not read like a victory announcement. It read like an accounting problem. 6 riflemen, 11 hours, more than 200 Japanese troops pressing back toward a position they believed could not be held. Then another number. About 180 Gurkhas had moved through country British staff officers had marked as impassable, entered the rear of a fortified Japanese system, cleared its first bunkers in silence, and vanished before the defenders could even agree on the size of the force inside their wire. This is not a story about men being brave. Burma had too many brave men already. Bravery was everywhere. Bravery was filling casualty roles. This is a story about the moment the 3rd Battalion, 6th Gurkha Rifles stopped treating the jungle as a punishment and started treating it as a weapon. By the winter of 1942, the British Army in Asia had learned a lesson it had no polite language for. In just 141 days, Japanese forces had driven British, Indian, and Burmese units hundreds of miles from Rangoon toward India. Men arrived at the border sick, hollow-eyed, and stripped of every comfortable belief their officers had carried into the campaign. The old assumption had been simple. The Japanese soldier was disciplined but limited, courageous but predictable, a fighter who would struggle under the weight of modern war. Then the jungle proved the opposite. Japanese infantry moved at night when British units waited for dawn. They crossed terrain that British maps treated as closed. They attacked from slopes, gullies, watercourses, and rear angles that defensive plans had not even bothered to respect. The jungle had become Japanese ground, and until that changed, every road back into Burma would be paid for in British and Indian lives. The first Arakan campaign was supposed to begin that reversal. The Mayu Peninsula mattered because Akyab mattered. Akyab meant airfields, harbor access, and a possible southern doorway back into Burma. But the campaign ran into a defensive system at Donbaik that looked primitive from a distance and murderous from close range. Earth, bamboo, logs, overhead cover. Bunkers sunk deep enough that shellfire smashed the surface and left the men underneath alive. Fewer than 500 Japanese defenders held that belt. 7 battalion strength attacks went in from the front. 7 came apart. Artillery disappeared into the cover. Infantry advanced along obvious approaches. Machine guns waited where the ground forced men to move, and each new attack proved the same brutal fact. The problem was not that the attackers lacked courage. The problem was that the defense had been designed to kill courage from the front. So the Gurkhas asked a different question. Not, how do you break the wall? Where does the wall stop looking? That question sounds simple only after someone has survived long enough to ask it. The men of the 3rd Battalion had been recruited from hill country in Nepal, from communities where movement over broken ground was not a special skill but a condition of life. Many had grown up carrying loads on paths that punished weak ankles, weak lungs, and careless feet. A rifleman who reached the battalion already understood gradients, darkness, weight, and silence in his bones. But the battalion's value in Arakan was not folklore. It was not that Gurkhas were somehow immune to fear. They were not. Their advantage was more dangerous than fearlessness. They could be patient. They could be still. They could take a landscape an enemy believed was secure and read it for the one place where attention failed. Before the assault, there were 6 days of almost nothing. That is the part popular war stories usually skip because nothing is difficult to dramatize. No charge, no bugle, no smoke-covered advance. Just patrol sections lying in wet undergrowth close enough to hear Japanese voices and far enough away to stay alive. 40 yards, 50 yards, sometimes less. Hour after hour they counted sentries. They watched relief parties. They traced the angles of firing ports. They learned which bunker spoke to which trench. They marked the communication lines. They waded through mosquitoes, heat, cramps, and the body's own demand to move. Because the first weapon in that operation was not the kukri. It was information. By the end of those 6 days, the battalion knew something artillery had not been able to discover. At about 03:30, the Japanese perimeter rotated its sentries. For a few minutes, the old watch was tired. The new watch was settling in. And the whole defensive system had a tiny weakness. Not a gap in the wire, not an open gate, a weakness in attention. And attention in the jungle was a kind of armor. At night the Gurkhas began the approach. No road carried them. No guide rope marked the route. The line of movement ran across ridges, re-entrants, streambeds, and ground that had already been dismissed as impossible for a formed unit carrying combat loads. The plan allowed 3 days. They reached the assault area in less than 2. That was the first defeat suffered by the Japanese position. It happened before a single Japanese soldier knew the battle had begun. The lead section was small enough to be swallowed by the dark. A Nake, 3 riflemen, a Bren gunner, 5 men moving ahead of the main body, close enough to become the first mistake the Japanese never recovered from. Somewhere beyond the expected perimeter, a sentry challenged them. The answer took seconds. No rifle fired, no alarm spread. One body fell into the dark and the section froze. For 11 minutes they did nothing. That stillness mattered. A frightened patrol would have rushed. A dramatic patrol would have attacked. A disciplined patrol waited to see whether the jungle had heard them. It had not, so they moved again. At 03:47, 2 Gurkha companies came out of cover toward the rear bunker complex. The distance was not large, about 50 yards of open ground. But in a night assault, 50 yards can become a lifetime if the defenders wake up halfway across it. The men did not scream. They did not fire. They ran in a controlled sprint, low and fast, each man trying to cross the exposed ground before a half-awake sentry could turn suspicion into aim. Their kukris were drawn, not because a blade was more powerful than a rifle. It was not. A Lee Enfield could kill farther. A Bren could dominate a lane. A grenade could tear the inside of a bunker apart. But a rifle shot tells every man within 500 yards where to look. A kukri tells only the man it reaches. The first bunker died without a gunshot, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. Inside those positions, the Japanese defense had been built around a forward-facing imagination. The firing slits watched the approach roads. The interlocking arcs covered the ground where battalions had already tried to come through. The bunkers were strong because everyone had treated the front as the only meaningful direction. The Gurkhas arrived from the sentence the defense had not finished writing. Behind. The 5th bunker broke the silence. One Japanese soldier fired at a shape he may only have half seen. And after that the operation changed shape. The silence was gone. The method was not. The Gurkhas did not dissolve into a mob. They cleared corners. They threw charges. They cut lines. They moved from one piece of the position to the next, before the defense could understand whether it was facing a raid, a breakthrough, or an entire battalion in its rear. In later summaries, the violent part of the action could be reduced to less than 20 minutes. That number hides the truth. Those 19 minutes had been built by 6 days of stillness, 2 nights of movement, and years of learning how not to waste sound. By the time the firing steadied, the rear bunker complex had been torn open. More than 20 Japanese casualties were counted in that sector. Several Gurkhas were wounded. Communication lines to the forward positions were severed, and 2 of the bunkers that had helped anchor the defense were gone. But the strangest part came after the fighting. The Gurkhas did not stand on the captured ground and wait to be surrounded. They did not turn the raid into a trophy. They took their wounded, they carried what they needed, and they withdrew back into the Mayu Hills before daylight could give the Japanese the advantage of certainty. When the sun rose, the Japanese command near Donbaik knew something had happened behind its line. That was all. Reports later described the attack as an infiltration of unknown strength. That phrase matters, unknown strength. The defenders did not know whether 5 men had entered first or 500 were waiting in the trees. They did not know how the wire had been passed. They did not know which part of their perimeter had failed. They did not know whether the next night would bring another silence behind them. In war, fear is not always created by what the enemy does. Sometimes it is created by what he proves he can do again. And that is why the brigade report landed with such force. Not because it contained courage. Everyone had courage. It contained ratio, method, a clean difference between what was committed and what was achieved. A fortified line that had absorbed 7 battalion attacks from the front had been entered from the rear by a unit that moved through supposedly closed country. A bunker system designed to defeat visible assault had been weakened by men who made themselves nearly impossible to observe. A command that trusted depth, cover, and machine gun arcs had been punished by timing, patience, and the small human lapse at a sentry change. That was the real lesson. The Gurkhas had not found a magical weakness in Japanese infantry. They had found a tactical weakness in certainty. The Japanese had learned to use the jungle against an army that moved by road, by map, by daylight, and by frontal doctrine. The 3rd Battalion answered by becoming a different kind of infantry. Not louder, not larger, not more heroic in the shallow sense, more exact. They made darkness part of the plan, They made stillness part of the plan. They made terrain a partner instead of an obstacle. They treated the bunker line not as a symbol of enemy strength, but as a physical object with angles, blind spots, habits, and a rear side that still had to be guarded by tired human beings at 0330. That is the difference between bravery and method. Bravery says, go forward. Method asks, forward from where? The smaller action in the report made the same point even more brutally. 6 Gurkha riflemen held a captured position for 11 hours while a Japanese relief force tried to pry it back. 6, not a company, not a platoon. 6 men with rifles, grenades, a Bren gun, and the advantage of occupying the ground before the enemy understood how they had got there. More than 200 Japanese troops pressed toward them through terrain that should have favored numbers. But numbers only matter when they can arrive in order. For 11 hours, the Gurkhas turned the position into a delay machine. They forced movement into narrow approaches. They made every rush pay. They held until withdrawal became possible, and when the count reached headquarters, it did not sound like glory. It sounded impossible. That was why the silence at brigade headquarters mattered. A senior officer reading the report did not need someone to explain bravery to him. He had seen enough brave men buried in Burma. What stopped him was the discovery that courage could be made efficient, that a small unit, trained for the right terrain, disciplined enough to wait, and ruthless enough to act at the exact minute, could do what larger formations had failed to do by pushing harder at the obvious point. The jungle had not changed. The hills had not become kinder. The night had not become safer. The bunkers had not become weaker. The only thing that changed was the question being asked. How do we attack this position became? Where has this position forgotten it has a back? And once that question existed, the wall on the map was no longer a wall. It was a machine. A machine made of earth, bamboo, logs, wire, firing lanes, routines, assumptions, and men who still had to blink, sleep, listen, and change guard. Machines fail at their seams. The Gurkhas found the seam in darkness. They reached it without being seen. And by morning the unbreakable line had learned that the jungle did not belong to one army anymore. The front had bravery. The Mayu Hills rewarded something rarer, patience with a blade behind it, and silence moving exactly where a wall had forgotten to look.